Hello everyone and welcome to my little corner of the internet. My name's Michael and I'm bitten by radioactive book. Today is Thursday and that means guides on my channel. And today we're starting with a new series of guides. We're looking into fantasy and its subgenres. So this first guide, or this first part of this guide, will be more of an introduction of what you can expect from the following parts, and it will deal with the kind of description of the terms of high fantasy and low fantasy, and why from my personal view there's a lot of misconception about these terms, and that not every book that is considered a high fantasy is actually a high fantasy. So we're looking into that distinction in a little while, but just let me start by filling you in what this guide will be about and its structure. When you're reading reviews about a fantasy novel, you often encounter sentences like, it's a high fantasy sword and sorcery with grimdark elements. And you're like, what? What is the person talking about? So there are obviously a lot of subgenres inside fantasy, and it's kind of hard to distinguish which is which. For example, if you hear there's like dark fantasy and then there's grimdark fantasy. So we will look into what is the difference, because there are actually totally different genres from each other. What I'm trying to do with this guide is to give you a bit of an overview about each genre. So each part of the guide will feature one genre or one subgenre, and then of course giving you like 3, 4, maybe 5 recommendations of what books are maybe good starting points to get into this kind of subgenre, or which just represent that kind of subgenre really well. I haven't really figured out how many of those subgenres I'm going to do, so I don't have a like full-on list for you now, and saying maybe this is 8-part or 10-part series. I'm pretty sure we're looking into the terms of grimdark, of dark, of sword and sorcery. We will be looking into contemporary fantasy, urban fantasy, maybe paranormal romance. We're looking into military fantasy, I think, so this will be 7, alright. And we will tackle the obscure, massive, blurry object that is epic fantasy. So so you see there will be at least like 8 parts, but maybe there are other subgenres that I'm going to include as well. But this will be like the main body of it. So today let's start with a subject that is, I think, one of the most misused or misconceptions of fantasy. For example, if you go to the Wikipedia and look up the term of high fantasy, the description there couldn't be more wrong. Because it tells you, and this is something that is widely believed, that it's enough for a fantasy novel just to happen in a secondary world to be considered high fantasy, and that in opposite, low fantasy is set in our modern world. Nice try, but not correct. If you look into the terms itself, it says something is high in high fantasy that is low in low fantasy. So what is actually high and low? When we speak about high, we mean that this story or the narrative has a high amount of fantastical elements. Fantastical elements being magic, fantastical races, elves, dwarves, orcs, magical objects, active gods, like mingling in the lives of the people. This might not be an exhaustive list, but it gives you an idea what to look for. And let's take two examples, two very well-known books. Let's take The Lord of the Rings on the one hand, which is a high fantasy, and which take A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin, which is a low fantasy. And it's very often you see a Song of Ice and Fire referred to as a high fantasy, but actually it is not. So if you look at these elements, for example, let's look at magic. Magic is not very important in both worlds. So if you're I think a normal citizen from Bree, for example, in The Lord of the Rings, then magic won't affect your life very often. It's not like in other fantasies, in other high fantasies, that magic replaces technology and you have like little magical objects in your household or stuff like that. That's not happening in Tolkien's world. But for the narrative, for the story itself, magic is of high, or the importance of magic is very high, because you have Gandalf, and Gandalf is a magic user, and Gandalf is a prominent character in the story. You also have Saruman in the story, and he's also very important. And if you look into what kind of is connected with magical objects, the ring itself, being a magical object, is of course central to the story, as are things like Sting, the sword of Frodo that can glow in the dark when or glow blue when orcs are near, or the Lambus bread, something that fools you, although you just have eaten a tiny bit of it. So there are a lot of magic elements, magic itself, and magical objects that are very central to the narrative and are very present. So the amount of magic that we're seeing in The Lord of the Rings is quite high. On the other hand, when you look into A Game of Thrones, there are also not that many magic users, really. You might have Melisandre, you might have some that are rumored to be magic users, but if there's any magic at all in the world, it's very, very outside, like maybe in the north with the Children of the Forest, maybe in Ashai under the shadow with the in the east, but the amount of magic that actually affects the narrative is very, very low. You have 2 or 3 occasions of having R'hllor intervene for Tauros and Melisandre, and you have that bit with the connection of the Stark children and the dire wolves, which is of course important. But if you compare it to the amount of just mundane narrative that is totally without magic or magical objects, there are whole characters like Tyrion, Jaime, Cersei, Eddard, where magic doesn't play a single role in their whole narrative. And so if you compare the amount of magic used actively or being part of the narrative in Lord of the Rings, the amount is far more high than it is in A Game of Thrones. Then if you look, of course, into things like magical races and magical creatures, again, in Lord of the Rings, they are present. elves are, although on the way to leave leave Middle Earth, they are known. People know that elf exists and that elf shaped the history of the world. So did dwarves. Dwarves are present. Hobbits are. We know that orcs are. They are not legends. They are part of the everyday life. And so the amount of their impact for the world and for the narrative is rather high. If you look into a Game of Thrones again, all people there are human. The only races or different races we might make out would be the ones from the north, with the children of the forest on the one hand, and there are more like rumors about them, and we're not really sure if they exist or not for a long time of the narrative. And so the only, if you want to call it race, that is actively present are the giants and and the White Walkers. But again, their impact on the whole narrative in comparison to the more mundane narrative of most of the POVs is very low. So that the impact is not as high as in the Lord of the Rings. Divine intervention gods are both not very active in both stories. So in the Lord of the Rings, you have this religious backdrops with every race having their own religion and gods they pray to, but the gods don't get really actively involved in the trilogy itself. And that even the impact in a Game of Thrones is that the gods have on the narrative is higher than in the Lord of the Rings. But again, in Game of Thrones, the only god that might show some power or bestow some power to his priest seems to be Relor. All the others, there are no like the typical role-playing cleric who can call on the divine healing powers of his gods or do miracles. There are no rules to that. And besides from Relor, all the other religions, the gods don't seem to have an actual impact on the story. So if you see that kind of comparison between high and low fantasy, you maybe spot a little that these terms are not really genres for fantasy, but either a distinction about the amount of fantastical elements that you can expect in a narrative. So if you see those terms, as I said, they're often misused, but in your head you should have this idea that a high fantasy is often some narrative that has a lot of these fantastical elements, and when something is considered a low fantasy, like maybe you see that often with Joe Abercrombie or maybe Mark Lawrence, so more of the grimdark, more realistic settings referred to as low fantasy, then you know that things like magic, magical creatures, magical races don't have that high amount of an impact for the story. So I hope I could bring a bit of light to these two terms, and next week we're going to start with the actually really subgenres of fantasy, and I think I'm going to start with Grimdark fantasy because I'm quite, or I know a lot of this subgenre and I read it a lot, so we're going to start with that. So far, I hope you liked this little introduction. If you did, please hit the like button. If you want to see more of me, subscribe to my channel. If you want to know what's coming up on my channel, look below in the description box. There's a little segment called On the Horizon. I wish you a good day and hope you get bitten by a really good book too. Bye.